criminal behaviorology, a combination of criminology and behavior analysis to assist the criminal and civil justice systems to improve our society in general. A podcast like no other. Here is your host, Timothy Joseph.
Hi, Tim.
Marilyn, how are you?
I'm good. Pretty hot here in Michigan. Well, you're in Michigan too, right?
Yes, I'm over here on the western side. You're on the eastern side.
Yeah.
It's been about 80 degrees.
Oh, it's cooler there then. It's like 88 right now. And
Oh,
it's
my.
going to get hotter in the next few days.
Oh, my. Well, I guess you're getting the hot portion of the state over on the east side.
I guess so.
Yeah.
We don't have the lake close, so.
Okay. If it's okay with you, could I just start? I've got the recorder running, and if I could just ask you a few things. You wrote the study, A Behavioral Approach to Understanding Domestic Violence, in 2008 with two other co-authors. And we found that to be quite interesting. It has to do with domestic violence and operant conditioning. Can you maybe give us a kind of a general view of I don't know, the models and intervention programs for domestic violence? What has been the traditional view, and maybe to talk a little bit about the Duluth model and the CBT model?
Okay. Sure. So I think that the more traditional model is called the Duluth model. And that's actually, I think at one time was law in like 35 states. I'm not sure if that changed. But it's all based on kind of a personality theory that people who engage in domestic violence against a victim have a personality disorder. We used to call them sociopaths. Mm-hmm. And so that's one point of view, and a very traditional point of view. The behavioral view on everything is quite different than traditional psychology, and makes some assumptions. The assumptions that it makes are that pretty much all voluntary behaviors are learned, mm-hmm. and they're learned either through classical or operant conditioning. Mm-hmm. And so with the operant model, what that would mean is that, and if the behaviors are voluntary, mm-hmm. And we consider domestic violence to be a behavior that some people choose to engage in, so right. It is, intentional mm-hmm. behavior, and so therefore the assumption is that it's getting rewarded somehow.
Right.
So we did a study that was just an assessment piece that has some implications for what we could do with intervention. Kind of moving over to the cognitive behavior therapy model, mm-hmm. which is behavioral and based on operant and classical conditioning. Mm-hmm. A lot of that focus, I think, in domestic violence has been in helping the victim overcome the trauma that they've experienced.
Right.
And so that part of it is more classical conditioning, but our focus was on the behavior of the victimizer or uh-huh. the perpetrator. And so we wanted to try to see if we could understand, first of all, whether this personality theory would be correct, and secondly, if there were different rewards that might apply to different individuals. Mm-hmm. And so we started out by asking a lot of questions about what were the antecedents to the behavior, and we had a checklist, a rating scale and we asked
Is that the
perpetrators, excuse me?
Marilyn, is that the Battering Assessment Tool?
That's the Battering Assessment Tool that was, the data were incorporated in that article. Uh-huh. And so the Battering Assessment Tool asked about a lot of antecedents, and they asked the perpetrators to basically rate the extent to which different events preceded their abusive behavior. Mm-hmm. And so those were in categories of emotions, negative emotions that they were experiencing, had also to do with things that were frustrating them, and maybe even the behavior of other people, things that had gone wrong in their life outside the relationship immediately before. So kind of like what sorts of emotions were they experiencing, what sorts of situations were they experiencing, and could those lead us to assume then that if the victimization occurred immediately following those events, then we could make some assumptions about what was rewarding the behavior. And so that kind of so basically what we found in that survey is that, and I'm not quite remembering the exact percentages, but in the vast majority of percentages of perpetrators, and we had interviewed or we had about 75 people answer the questionnaire. We found that in the vast majority of people, it was a combination of negative emotions that person was experiencing for whatever reason, combined with the behavior of their partner or other people in their immediate environment. And then to the extent that they endorsed consequences, then it made them feel better for a short period of time. It relieved the emotional pressure or got the person to stop doing something that was annoying them or upsetting them or hurting them. And so we did find that that maybe in some cases, perhaps even in a large percent of cases, that it wasn't so unreasonable what they were trying to do, alleviate their negative emotions, get their partner to do something or stop doing something or provide some emotional support. But it was that so their needs weren't so inappropriate. It was the inappropriate thing was very inappropriate way that they were going about doing that. And so I guess then the implications of that would be that if you could teach people alternative methods, such as, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with dialectic behavior therapy, for example.
So, like maybe you would do some kind of differential reinforcement.
Yeah, maybe we would teach them, yes, exactly. We would teach them other behaviors, other impersonal. Usually, I think those other behaviors would be coping skills that would help them regulate their emotions, and also more direct forms of communication with their partners, and let's trying to find ways of positively approaching their partners and getting changes in behavior through that means. And I don't know if you want. I don't probably need to go into too much detail about what that would entail.
Well,
sure.
I think you're doing okay. Just to recap, this is already quite a bit different than, say, just a personality typology, or I would assume the idea of the personality is we would identify which type of people would become batterers, and then you could just stay away from them, or we'd keep a close eye on them or something. Well, this viewpoint is saying we need to look more at the learning history and the environment that the batterers are in, and maybe they're not that much different than other people that don't batter, the men that don't batter. It's just a matter of their learning history and what we can do with the environment. Is that an adequate?
Yes. So their learning history, both in terms of the behavior repertoire that they don't have. So in other words, the skill set that is deficit, as well as their learning history with regard to this behavior works. So we're kind of battling against both kinds of learning history that the battering works to impact their partner and works to at least momentarily alleviate their feelings. makes them feel in control, perhaps even.
Mm-hmm.
We're kind of battling against that, but sort of thinking in terms of substituting that behavior for other more appropriate. So building their skill set and their repertoire of coping skills and communication skills.
When you did the study, were these batterers court ordered, or I mean, how did they become cooperative? They were court ordered, and they were
they were court ordered to participate in a city in Michigan, and they were in a program they were required to attend. And we did find some small subset of people who were just, I don't know. We got, for example, a couple of threatening messages on on one or two of the rating scales. So I'm sure that there is a small subset of people, and some of the indicators were there in terms of answers, the way that they answered the rating scale. So I think that there are some subset of people who were like, the degree of demand that they would require or of their partner would be outrageously unreasonable, and so and actually those people probably have better skills to accomplish. You know what I'm saying? They're, sometimes the sociopath people with personality disorders sometimes are very charming individuals, very engaging, and very, they know exactly how to control someone else.
I was just about kind of as an aside, not too far aside, but from a behavioral point of view, what is a sociopathic or psychopathic personality? What is that, would you say?
I am not sure, because it's, not, I think, I'm not sure that I can answer it, but if I had to give it my best guess in terms of any kind of reading that I've done and just behavior theory in general, sort of sticking with that behavioral framework, I would say that usually it's people who have experienced some kinds of trauma or evaluation for long periods of time in their early life, and they grew up or they spent long periods of time in some very dysfunctional situations, and as a result they have emotional wounds that kind of leave them very, very needy compared to other people. And I think that pretty much captures the deeper spectrum of personality disorders in a general way.
Right.
And very, very needy, emotionally needy. And also they've developed patterns of behavior that you and I would consider dysfunctional.
Right.
But really those patterns that's kind of a misnomer to call them dysfunctional, because really for them, in serving their needs, those patterns of behavior are very functional in an operant conditioning sense. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's very well put. I was going to say that if it's anything, it is the developed talent to do all these things, to lie effectively, to manipulate, to intimidate, to do all these things that we attribute to sociopathic behavior, and then the skill deficits of just not being able to do things just the right way, or to do them the socially acceptable way, and that probably comes from those things that you described of a traumatic history or a history of a lot of antisocial behavior around you. So
so they can get their they don't have a problem getting their partner to do what they want them to do, I don't think. But I think that whatever their partner does never really satisfies their emotional need in terms of their attachment, because they're, I don't know, either not capable of having that kind of emotion, or they just have a lot of healing to do, or as I'm now kind of getting to, it's hard to talk about it from a behavioral point without kind of getting into the mentalistic lingo there a little bit. But
it's to talk about the social problems it's almost impossible to avoid some kind of mentalistic language on it. I've encountered that myself.
And I would say that their deficit lies more in their ability to cope with their emotional, to regulate their emotions,
right,
their own emotions.
For the BAT, back to so your findings from the BAT were there were probably a whole lot of batterers that just didn't have these sociopathic tendencies. Another way to say it, your findings, that there was, that I think would be surprising to people or those that had researched this for many years, is there was a whole lot that just didn't have significant personality problems, whatever those are.
Yes, there were the vast majority of people were people that just didn't have skills, didn't have communication skills, didn't have, and it was hard to, the scale was not designed to differentiate between, sociopaths and typical people,
right.
But it was, but if you kind of looked more subjectively at the items that were endorsed, I think that you would see that pattern, or at least let's just say this, that there was evidence for potential to, that at least if people could identify the antecedents that that led to the abuse, you could make a reasonable conclusion that perhaps you could teach some other behaviors that would get at that. I think that the only way to maybe get at that question, sociopath versus healthy person, is maybe questions regarding what their attitudes were about what would be reasonable expectations of a partner. And our questionnaire didn't really ask those questions. But some of the questions did seem like reasonable things, like if your partner was hitting you and you hit them back, it would be an appropriate need to have them stop hitting you.
Right.
But going about it by hitting them back isn't going to really solve it. I mean, it perhaps could get them to stop hitting you, but it's not a real solution. Getting your partner to show you love and affection seems like a reasonable need, but there are a whole lot better ways of getting that to happen. Expecting that your partner is going to want to have sex with you is a reasonable need in an intimate relationship, at least on a, if it's not on a too super frequent basis. But, there's certainly, you would think of other more, other kinds of skills other than, certainly, you're not going to put them in the mood by engaging in that behavior. So, so those were the kinds of things, like we did have questions about, my partner's doing this, my partner's not doing that, and most of them were stated, could be interpreted as reasonable, reasonable things that you would want your partner to do and you would do for each other.
So it sounds like it could develop into something that looks very much like when we have other plans for severe problem behavior. The setting, the topography, you have an idea of what to reinforce that's different than the usual pattern of behavior. Right.
And it's very different from the Duluth model, because my observations of the Duluth model were you get a bunch of people in a circle, you assume that they're sociopaths, and then you have discussions, and then you kind of force them to be accountable and to be, so that's the session I observed, where if someone said something that didn't seem like they were taking responsibility, then the facilitators would kind of call them out and say, no, it doesn't sound like you're being accountable for your own behavior. And so it seemed like, to me, this is another operant conditioning concept of verbal behavior, that I'm sure that you can teach people to talk the right way.
Yeah.
But is that really going to, you can get people to say what they need to say, and especially if they are sociopaths, because they're crafty about, what they need to do.
Yeah.
So I just don't see how shaping someone's verbal behavior is going to translate into them being less abusive when they go. I mean, that's a lot of generalization to have happen. Mm-hmm. And the behaviors are very different. The verbal behavior is very different than the abuse. So,
is this concept that it could be based on operant conditioning? Is this an explanation for why the traditional programs like you described for batterers have not been very successful?
Yeah, I think it could be. I think that you could use this. I mean, that was kind of the intention, or, the idea behind it, is that you could sort of sort people out in terms of who was battering primarily to deal with their negative emotions, who was battering because they lacked control in their everyday life, who was battering because they were trying to get their spouse's attention or affection, who was battering to try to get their spouse to stop yelling at them or hitting them. And so then I think, there's a lot of therapies that are already out there that could be applied to that. And I think mostly in terms of dialectic behavior therapy, the interpersonal skills part of things, assertiveness training, asking people to do things, and the emotion regulation skills that are included in that program apply also.
Did your results find that the batterers had an awareness of what was rewarding their abusive behavior? Did they have an understanding of that, or were they kind of disconnected from that?
They were kind of disconnected from that. They were pretty good at identifying the antecedent events and conditions, how they felt beforehand, what they felt elicited or evoked the behavior, I guess you'd say. But they were kind of at a disconnect with, now I feel more in control, or now I feel less depressed or less anxious or less frustrated, or now my partner is doing what I want them to be doing. And so, they didn't recognize the consequences, much the same way that I think in other areas where people, they know they eat for eating, for example, emotional eating. They know they eat when they're anxious or they're nervous or they're bored, but they don't pay attention to that immediate relief of that feeling once they do.
It's another kind of indicator to me of that operant conditioning has to do with violent behavior like this, because it's a lot like I guess we'd say we don't tend to think too much about why we do the things we like to do or are very motivated to do. We might think about justifications for it or things we have to say to make it happen, but an awareness of why we are conditioned or why we like to do something, we tend not to be so conscious of that, I guess I would put it.
Yeah, like you almost just take for granted rewarding consequences.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that if you asked people, if you made it more salient to them, if you said, okay, so you say that your abuse happens when your anxiety reaches this level where you're just feeling overwhelmed, then when you hit your spouse, then are you relieved of that anxiety for a little while? I think they would answer yes. I just don't think that they don't observe it without you pointing to that consequence for them. So maybe that's another avenue is to sort of teach people what their motivation is, because the motivation is about the reward, and usually it's basically it's negative reinforcement in this case,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. You could look
It's
at
all negative reinforcement, pretty much. I mean, there are some times when, maybe they are trying to get their spouse to have sex with them. Maybe, there's a few positive reinforcers mixed in there, but for the most part, they're using it to alleviate, aversive social situations as well as emotional situations.
Well,
But
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Oh, I interrupted that. Well, you were talking about negative reinforcement about getting the abused victim, getting their wife to have less contact with her family and friends. Is that a negative reinforcement? If you batter and then she has...
Well, that's a good question, and I would say that happens more often in those cases of the true sociopath. Because they're not, because a lot of these people are kind of responding to like momentary things. But when you think about getting, I don't think that they abuse to get them, well, they might abuse to get them to spend less time, but they usually create other mechanisms to cut their spouse off. It's called insularity or insulating. And so that seems like that is more of a planned out strategy rather than I think that the people that can be helped most are these people who are just kind of acting in the moment. There's maybe a situation that builds up to a crescendo and then they just can't handle it anymore and then they behave in this way. But it would seem to me like keeping people away from other people. I don't know if that's a strategy that by the vast majority of the people, I think that would be more the sociopathic type. Okay. I think there is a sociopathic type for sure.
Right.
And then I don't know what's to help those. The only thing I can think of is really just get the person out of that environment.
Have you had a chance to speak with victims of abuse about your findings and what has been their reaction?
Well, that is interesting. Actually, some of the people, not the authors on this paper, but when we first started to do something, actually the impetus for it was these 4 or 5 women students that I just happened to have in class that had been victims. And so we designed a lot of the questions based on their personal experience and their experiences with other women that they knew. And, of course, the victims aren't necessarily women, but they are predominantly women.
Right.
So at any rate, that's kind of where we came up with a lot of the questions. And so that was kind of always something that we wanted to do, but there were some ethical considerations. So what we wanted to do originally was give the survey to the perpetrators and give it to their victims, and then match up the extent to which both the perpetrator and the victim in any particular dyad would endorse the same antecedents and consequences. I think that would be incredibly interesting, and I'll bet they could. And that was one of the things that the women who were involved in helping us think about the study and conduct it, those women were saying it's kind of a universal thing among abused women that they can predict it really well. But in part, they predicted by the person's behavior. Maybe they can see the person getting, gradually overwhelmed and more easily frustrated, more easily angered. I don't know exactly, and it may be different in different situations, which behaviors predict. So maybe they're predicting it more from the behavior from their spouse's behavior than from the actual, because they wouldn't necessarily have access to that person's private emotional state.
Uh-huh. Do you think it could be that the victims are so familiar with the antecedents that they can predict the violence?
Yeah, I think so. I think that at least in part, it's that.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they also, I mean, there generally is a period afterwards where the perpetrator is remorseful, and maybe at that point they share what their emotions were leading up to, or, you know, things like that. So maybe they know that way.
Is that period of at least acting remorseful, or if it's genuine, or that period of like I've lost the word, but kind of reunion, or, you know, trying to make up for what they did, is that a reinforcing agent that keeps the domestic violence relationship going?
I'm sure it is.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure that those promises, and of course it's parallel to alcoholics and gamblers and other individuals who perhaps really genuinely do have good intentions, but since they don't have the skills, when they find themselves in that situation again, they only have one way of coping with it, so they resort right back to that behavior and aren't able to control it, I guess. But I'm sure that that's what keeps the victim, you know. And there's a secrecy thing, you know, and I mean, maybe there is some sort of, you know, maybe it does have the purpose of keeping the person away from. I think that, you know, in many cases there are, you know, making the person feel inadequate. But again, I think that those are the things that the true sociopaths do, you know, keep them away from their family, make them feel like they're not good enough for anyone else. They're lucky to be in this relationship. I'll promise not to do it again. I know I shouldn't do it anyway. I love you. I adore you. So I don't know. I don't know the extent to which that applies to the individuals I'm thinking of that could actually be helped. So.
Well, I guess I was going to say it seems so much like other kinds of, once again, like severe behavior problems, where if people could see it from the outside, so you have this reinforcement and then you have all this violence, but a lot of behavior problems, there's this intermittent reinforcement. You really don't see the reward very often, or it's very hard to see.
That's true.
You just see the and of course, that's what we see. So with a lot of these domestic violence situations, people are just seeing, and the police and all that, they're just seeing all the domestic violence, and they're thinking, why is this continuing? Why could this go on for years and years like this, when it just takes?
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, that's, you know, kind of like what you see in children who tantrum, for example.
Right.
It's highly resistant to extinction behavior because of the intermittent reinforcement. But I don't know if that's true in this case, because I would think if someone's hitting you, that every time you're going to back off. I would think that if you're angry or you're frustrated, that every time it, you know, makes you feel better somehow. I think that I don't know. There's like there's something to the physicality of it too. I think I don't know, or the intensity of the emotion that's aroused. I mean, there's kind of there's like a calm after the storm kind of thing. Like, you know, it's pretty intense, and so then there's this wind up, and then the abuse, and then it's like, you know, sigh. I've exhausted myself. Maybe I don't know. Right. And I mean, I'm sure that also. I think that it's worth mentioning that even though I think that the function of the behavior and understanding more about the function of the behavior and even understanding that on an individualized basis, I think does provide tremendous opportunity to come up with a better model of treating people and getting them to stop that violence.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I'm sure it's an oversimplification as
Right.
well.
Yeah.
It's a very dynamic, there's a lot of dynamics going on other than just the antecedents and the consequences surrounding it.
Yeah. Do you think you will get, for something, an idea like this, have you or would you receive criticism from people that follow a more traditional view? Would they accuse you of not being sensitive to the victims or perhaps even justifying the behavior of the perpetrators?
Right. We definitely have gotten that, and that was definitely not our intention. That is, we did encounter that sort of thing. We got turned down a lot of places because when we would explain the model to people, they would say, "Are you saying that in some cases it's the behavior of the victim?" And we would say, "Well, not that the victim, that doesn't mean that the victim is to blame, that perhaps the victim had every reason to, perhaps the victim was behaving completely appropriately, and whatever that behavior was annoyed the person, and then they victimized them. And we're certainly not condoning those sorts of situations. But in cases where the victim is doing something that is hurtful, emotionally hurtful, physically hurtful to the other person, or they're being neglectful, they're being inattentive, or and again, we're not saying that they deserve to be treated like this because they have behaved like that. And that's why I think that maybe the intervention would have to involve both members of the couple, that if the perpetrator was trying new methods of communication to get the other person to do something, then it would be good to try to sensitize the victim to try to respond to those attempts as well. But don't just because the behavior of someone else is one of the antecedents that leads to the violent behavior doesn't mean that we're blaming. But it's good not to deny it and ignore that if that's the case, just because we want to stay as far as we can away from blaming. But perhaps there are behaviors that the victim needs to change as well for their own safety. If in fact those behaviors are triggering the violence in some way. So I don't know. There's probably a fine line, but I think that you can observe where that line is of blaming versus identifying.
Yeah. If the victim's behavior is a part of the environment that we could change, that could change the abusive behavior.
Yes, exactly.
I
think most victims would, if they knew some behavior that they could change to avoid the violence, or to reward more appropriate behavior, I think that they would do that.
Yeah. Right. It's a very sensitive concept to approach with people.
But as long as what you're asking them to do falls within the range of, appropriate expectations, let's just say, we always have to add that.
Yeah.
Because if we say that, the perpetrator, if you would just walk along that line in the middle of the sidewalk the way I asked you to, then you could avoid. That is not the kind of thing that we would condone at all. So you always have to add the caveat of it, as long as you're asking the victim to discontinue some behavior that is reasonable for them to discontinue, or to engage in some behavior that's reasonable to expect.
And maybe the behavior change could be something more in the direction of greater independence. It could be, being able to express what they feel in a way that's productive.
I suspect. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
So I think that that's absolutely true, because I suspect I was going to say something about the percentage of relationships. I know that there's a pretty high percentage of, aside from cases of domestic violence, that I know that couples that are in dissatisfied marriages, for example, I know that there's a high frequency of coercive interactions on the part of both partners, most generally. So in a dysfunctional relationship, I would expect that you would be seeing a lot of negative reinforcement going on, and that's what I mean by coercive interchanges, where I'll get in your face and intimidate you until you do what I want, but the other partner's doing the same thing. I suspect that there's a fair number, not all, but I mean, I suspect that there are at least some cases where that's going on, and I would think even in other cases where there isn't a lot of coercive back and forth, that still both people could benefit from some interpersonal relationship skills training, learning to say, or learning to ask your partner to do things in a manner that's going to be effective. Just off the top of my head, talking from the dialectic behavior therapy,
right.
You said that you were going to do this. You said you were going to be home by dinner. You didn't get home till 11. It makes me feel, so the I statement, that makes me feel bad and worried about you, or that you're taking me for granted. I'm going to need you to call next time. So you're saying what you need them to do. And, this business of, just character assassinations and yelling at the person, I think that people do those things, but if you ask them, does that ever work? They know it doesn't work, but they can't help but falling into those patterns anyway.
Yeah.
And so getting the other person to do what you would like them to do, and doesn't mean that it's always going to work. Sometimes they just can say no.
Right.
But if you could be more effective at getting your needs met by asking in a direct fashion and seeing, how that's going to make things better, how that's going to improve the relationship, or how that's going to you feel better, and then to negotiate those things. And then getting people to accept no. You've asked me to do that a lot of times, and I already have said no, and my answer's not going to change.
Yeah.
Those kinds of direct communications on the part of both parties, I suspect, are needed, because, I don't suspect too many people enter into relationships with someone who has zero communication skills, and that person has really good communication skills. There's probably both people have some deficits, is my guess.
They're about equally in deficit in that area, probably.
I would think.
Yeah. Where would you see research like this going in the future? How can we press this forward? What would you...
Well, I would see that research could go in a great direction if could use that battering tool or something like that to, I would think, maybe some sort of comprehensive program with a variety of different components. Maybe one component helping people regulate their own emotions. Maybe another component teaching people interpersonal relationship skills. Maybe another component, time management or something to kind of decrease their anxiety level, or so there might be a few different components, and then I would think that you would sort of identify which antecedents people had the perpetrators had the most trouble with, and then kind of assess their skill level in each of those areas, and then sort of do some expose them to whichever module was applied if they were good with their interpersonal skills, but they couldn't regulate their own emotions, and maybe just that component. And then maybe do some outcome things where, you could compare it to people who went through the Duluth model. But, research is difficult in that area because you'd be primarily measuring recidivism rates, right? And it's not easy to get your hands on those kind of data. And it's a tricky ethical area too. I mean, you wouldn't want to, I don't know, I could see it's a new model, it's an experimental model, so, anticipating what any negative results of the interventions, you'd want to try to do that, but I would think that some sort of treatment model, some sort of outcome research where maybe you could measure something other than, you might just be able to measure, at least you could demonstrate that their skill level had changed in those areas.
Do you think?
And hopefully that would translate into less incidents, but it's such a low frequency behavior to begin with. It's not like it happens 20 times a day. It happens once every 6 months, or maybe more often for some severe cases.
It's a rarely occurring severe behavior problem.
And it's a secretive behavior. So it doesn't always happen at an intensity or severity level where it gets the attention of other people, police and community and so forth.
Right. Do you think things need to change in society? Is there something socially that needs to change, the way social services reacts, police, the law, anything like that needs to change that would help the problem?
No, I haven't given that much thought. Maybe just if, we try to do these sensitivity kinds of training in other areas, like in mental health, making the police more aware of what a psychotic episode looks like, for example. I said making sensitivity training that's been done in areas where you try to make people more aware of what psychotic behavior looks like, maybe an awareness where if they know that the person's not dealing well with the situation, I don't know. I don't know. I haven't given that too much thought. What do you think?
When I've discussed this with groups about domestic violence, I said that there's all kinds of problems that we just accept that we don't really like, but we kind of accept. Okay, this is the way it is, and people go back to their abusive spouses, and we just deal with it as best we can. But if the public becomes aware that this is a problem that could be defined by its, it has a function, it can be measured in certain ways, and we can have interventions that could reduce or eliminate the problem behavior, the public might have a greater confidence in dealing with it. They may not be so prone to turn a blind eye or just being accepting of it until it gets really, really bad, that might be a benefit of approaching this from a behavioral point of view. That would be my spiel about it.
Yeah, so definitely if you could demonstrate increased effectiveness of this program compared to others, then you might get more buy-in from, donations to foundations or programs, more tax dollars going toward programs, but at least I don't think it would be any more expensive than the Duluth model. I mean, except for that I don't know, I conceptualize it as being one-on-one, more individualized,
Right.
whereas the Duluth model is a group.
model.
It's a group model. So, but maybe you could do it in a group format and do some role playing and things like that.
Yeah, they do behavioral interventions in group formats as well.
Right.
So, this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just thinking along your lines of your idea and just trying to think about what would be maybe more preventative stuff.
Right.
Too. I was thinking a little bit about research by. Are you familiar with research by Gottman? It's developmental research on couples, and over the years, and he looked at couples and engaged. Had them do interchanges, discussions, and then measured these a whole bunch of different behaviors. And he ended up identifying the 4 behaviors that are most predictive of couples' marriages falling apart.
Oh, I have heard of this. Yes.
Yeah. So it was like contemptuous behavior, stonewalling, criticism, and defensiveness were the 4 behaviors that were most predictive. And so I would think that especially that contemptuous behavior, if you saw that early on, that just seems like a very pattern of just at least one of the behaviors that I would consider just kind of predictive of that sort of coercive pattern.
Right.
So I don't know, maybe you could do more preventative stuff if you offered couples, couples training in how to communicate in a relationship constructively. Yeah. And they do have some things like that are along those lines, but I don't see how you could put that in place. But maybe some kind of couples training like that would be useful as part of, I think that it's possible to teach couples to have a good relationship, even if they come from a very dark place in terms of their history.
Yeah, it could help prevent this cycle of generation after generation falling into an abusive pattern.
Yeah. Maybe you could even do something with the kids or something as a. Well, let's not get carried away.
Right.
This has been Criminal Behaviorology. Check us out on Podomatic.com or Anchor.fm for this podcast, as well as our Facebook page and other social media sites.